Now, within the context of our topic, which is, again, policy dialogue on supporting climate resilience and a just transition and a just energy transition in Africa, I'll just give you a snippet of a background, which, of course, you would have, those of you who received the concept note would have noticed. It is said that climate change is a global commons problem that poses an outstanding or existential threat to the planet and humankind. But with regard to Africa, Africa's case is particularly concerning. Why? Because Africa has very little impact on climate change in terms of the causes of climate change, but bears the greatest brunt of climate change. It is said that between 1850 and 2020, Africa's contribution to global emissions remained below 3%. But it has lost 5% to 15% annually of GDP per capita between 1986 and 2015. So what is the objective of this panel? We want to be able to showcase the findings of the African Development Bank within its economic outlook for 2022, the impacts of climate change on Africa's economy. And so we have a whole panel to kickstart our discussion. Let me start with Professor Kevin Orama, who is, as I said, the acting vice president and chief economist of the African Development Bank, responsible for this study. When we talk about issues around supporting climate resilience and a just energy transition in Africa, what do we mean?
Thank you very much, moderator, and thank you, colleagues, for joining us. In addressing this question, I'm going to present the report, which Vincent has alluded to, on supporting climate resilience and a just energy transitions for Africa. Each year, the African Development Bank identifies a team, a policy team of interest for Africa and the global community, and does research to dig deeper into it to understand what that means in facts and what policy options African countries and the global community working with Africa should be pursuing. So this year we focused, of course, on supporting climate resilience and just energy transitions in Africa. Just to paint the picture, Africa's growth has always been resilient, going up and down for several reasons, which I'm not going to go into, because this is not the main theme of the presentation today. But if you look at it, you can find that during the COVID-19, Africa had a recession, contracting to 1.6% of its GDP, but it rebounded in 2021. But because of the confluence of factors, climate, conflicts, and other things, Africa's growth has always continued to go up and down. But the good thing is that we have seen resilience as a characteristic of Africa's growth all the time. So even after COVID-19, this picture is showing us that in all regions of the continent was able to rebound to positive growth. Whether you think about the regions of the continent or the types of structures of Africa's economies, people will be wondering, why am I talking about macroeconomic issues when we are talking about climate change? I'm going to show you the links between that growth and poverty with climate resilience and also just energy transitions in a very short while. So Africa has major challenges in its growth, one of which is on debt overhang. And I'm raising this because we're here at COP27 and we're discussing climate finance. And a lot of the climate finance that is being given to Africa comes in as debt instruments. And that, again, compounds this already big challenge of debt overhang on the continent. So that when we're discussing climate finance and climate resilience, we need to think about growth, we need to think about poverty reduction, and we also need to think about other socioeconomic and global development goals that we have. And then if we look at what Africa is already going through because of COVID, we need over 432 billion US dollars for recovering from COVID-19 alone. And that amount of money is something we need for an impact that is external to Africa, just like climate change is external to Africa. And a lot of the gains already made in terms of poverty reduction and socioeconomic goals, other SDGs, we saw a big reversals in them with over 30 million people being pulled into poverty. That's just to set the context that it's not only climate that Africa needs to deal with, but needs to deal with other socioeconomic and sustainable development goals. So when we delve into this issue around climate resilience, what does it mean for Africa? In that report, we find that in terms of climate vulnerability, climate readiness, and climate resilience, Africa is the second to South Asia in terms of climate vulnerability, the height of climate vulnerability around the global regions. But even at that, Africa is the least climate ready of all continents of the world. And this is because of several factors, again, economic structures of the economy, in terms of capacity for adaptation, financing, and several things that we need to consider as well. If you combine those two indicators and look at climate vulnerability and climate resilience, Africa is again the least resilient of many parts of the world. And we try to look deep into it and find out what's the reason for this lack of resilience in Africa, given that Africa is not emitting a lot of climate forcing emissions, and including CO2. And on the right panel there, you see we try to disaggregate by countries. And we find that climate resilience and climate vulnerability is highly correlated to economic growth. The more your GDP is growing, the more resilient you are to climate change and to climate shocks. So the poorer countries are more vulnerable to climate change. And that's obvious because you don't have the infrastructure, you don't have the institutions, you don't have the capacity to adapt to climate change. So this analysis already tells us we cannot de-link socioeconomic growth from climate resilience that we're discussing here and from climate policies. So if you look at the impacts of climate change in terms of when we discuss loss and damage, in Africa, you'll find that Africa is already losing 5 to 15% of its GDP growth per capita between 1986 and 2015. So a continent that's already losing this level of its GDP growth, you can already see why there's an economic imperative for Africa to deal with climate change very squarely. But this is in addition to increased mortality, migration, and other socioeconomic fragilities that creates problems in terms of growing the economy, but also in terms of adapting to climate change. So we need significant investments, and I want to repeat, significant investments for any reasonable climate policy in Africa to work. And saying this in the place of COP27, where we are going to be discussing climate finance, it is important for us to think about it with regard to the agreements we reached in COP21 as well, because climate sharing of technologies, climate finance, and so on were part of those agreements. Then we looked at climate justice and just transitions and how that implicates the SDGs around the world. And you find that access, sorry, if you just use one indicator, access to energy, you find that access to energy is highly correlated. Can someone get me water? You find that access to energy is highly correlated to economic growth. So any policy of climate that is going to be reducing Africa's access, universal access to energy, is invariably slowing down the growth of the continent Thank you so much. Is invariably slowing down the growth of the continent and reducing the capacity of Africa to adapt, as well as creating more implications for climate change. So there's a big nexus between poverty, growth, and climate resilience that we need to keep in mind as we continue to discuss the whole issues. Now, in terms of energy and just energy transitions, we try to look at energy mix of countries from the time we had data. And one thing you'll find very quickly is that energy transitions takes time. So it's not a policy of stop using one energy type or the other, but it's a way of how you mix the energy sources in your energy mix so that you stay within your carbon budget while transitioning to a greener energy pathway. And we also found that in many countries that have managed to transition, natural gas was a major source of what we call transition fuel that allowed countries to be able to transition. So by implication, we're also saying that natural gas should remain a transition fuel for the developing countries who still need to grow their economies, while provided that they still remain within their carbon budget. And we found that green line on top, that share of renewable energy is increasing, but is not increasing fast enough. You find that it is only in European Union that we've achieved up to 23% on average. But Africa's energy mix is also still very, very green. So what does this mean in terms of financing that we've been talking about? 85% of the global carbon budget has already been used up. But in Africa, Africa's contributions is still very low. Per capita usage, in terms of per capita CO2 emissions in Africa, is still at 0.95. And what is required to stay within the carbon budget per capita globally is 2. That means Africa still has some headroom within its carbon budget to continue to grow its economy without creating any major problem for reaching the Paris Climate Agreement. If you look at that figure for other regions like the United States, it's already 14. For Europe, it's already at 7. So there are differences in terms of how much we have already contributed and are contributing if we continue with the current energy mix that we have. If you look at that in terms of carbon credit and carbon budget, using the carbon market that we have, we estimate that Africa has a carbon credit of up to 4.6 trillion US dollars between now and 2030. And 2050. So this is a huge opportunity for the climate finance discussions that we are having. But again, when you look at the resource potentials of this continent, the continent has huge competitive advantages in every area of the just transitions in terms of harnessing green energy opportunities, whether it be in raw materials, I've listed a lot of them there, or in components that are required for the transitions that we're talking about. We've talked about battery minerals and all these things that are all in Africa, and several products and services that can be generated. So here is a huge opportunity for African countries to reinvest into its own natural resources in order to shape and lead the global transitions that we're talking about. But to do that, we need financing. The president at the Senate always talks about 3 major C's that is a major problem: the COVID, the conflicts, and climate change. But also 3 major F's that is required, and it is financing, financing, and financing. So we looked into financing to see what is going on, and I was very befuddled by what we found. One is that the structure of climate finance is so complicated and is so loosely defined. So even as we are discussing the 100 billion, it is really unclear what goes into that 100 billion and what should or shouldn't go into that 100 billion. And this loose definition is leading to a lot of rebranding of other development financing windows and mechanisms as climate finance, including, as I've mentioned before, debt financing, which is already increasing the debt vulnerabilities of countries that are already being stressed by climate change. So in many ways, the current structure of climate financing is shortchanging the vulnerable countries to climate change. And then the climate finance flows is also misaligned with climate vulnerability. What do we mean by that? Those who are more vulnerable to climate change don't have the capacity to receive climate finance. So even if we achieved the goal of increasing climate finance, it's actually going to more emitters than to the less emitters, which means it's actually not aligned to what climate finance is supposed to be achieving. And finally, the scale of climate finance currently is totally misaligned with the level of need for achieving the nationally determined contributions which we already agreed to as part of COP27 agreement. So for Africa, we find that to implement the nationally determined contributions, Africa will require up to 1.6 trillion US dollars between now and 2030. This is about 127 billion US dollars annually. But if you think about what Africa is currently receiving, between the period shown there, Africa is only receiving around 18.3 billion US dollars annually. This leaves a huge financing gap, climate financing gap, to be able to implement the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, which is a major pillar of the Paris Agreement. And let's keep in mind that that pillar of the Paris Agreement was agreed to by African countries on condition that 80% of it is conditional NDCs, which means 80% of that commitment depends on climate finance coming into Africa. So this means that at this current rate of having still huge gaps, we are discussing 100 billion for the whole developing countries, but we're seeing here from this analysis that Africa alone needs has a gap of 108 billion annually. So the scale of climate finance needs to be fast-tracked and stepped up if we are going to be serious about climate resilience and achieving the COP21 agreement. So based on these, we come up with a few recommendations. One is that we need serious policy coordination. Quite often, when we come to conferences of parties, we discuss issues about climate mitigation and climate adaptation. What this analysis is showing us that we need to discuss issues about poverty. We need to discuss issues about resilient infrastructure. We need to discuss issues about agriculture. We need to discuss issues about health because they are all interlinked. And climate change impacts is already impacting on all these sectors significantly. So we need serious policy coordination so that these kinds of conferences of parties is not just for environment ministers, but we need the finance ministers, central bank governors, and others. And what we've seen with COVID is that this interplay actually has significant implications for the macro-fiscal strength of countries. Then the second point we're making is that we need to build regional value chains. I've just talked about battery minerals in Africa. Let it not be that Africa will continue to export these battery minerals in raw forms and again, and this carries with it a lot of carbon footprint. When you export raw materials and buy back the vehicles, then you find that even the electric vehicles will have a lot of carbon baggage, like the carbon rucksack. Because if you look at the footprint of how it is exported and produced, then you have a lot of emissions around it. So this is encouraging countries and global conglomerates to please invest in Africa where those resources are so that we reduce the carbon footprints of those electric vehicles we are going to be producing instead of shipping them back and forth from distant lands. Raw materials going, final products coming in the global market, that just increases the carbon emissions that we're talking about. But we need to scale investments massively in renewable energy and green energy technologies. As we saw in the energy mixes of countries, it has not yet got to where it should. And the potentials are high, and Africa has huge potentials to lead the world in this area. But we also need to invest in institutions. We need to invest in capacity development. We need to invest in technologies. We need to invest in innovations within this continent, Africa, to be able to take an advantage of this. What should the global community do? First, we need to honor, and I want to slow down to say this one, honor the 100 billion climate finance commitment that was reached, because This is the only way to actually show some trust that the global community is serious about climate change. You have just seen that Africa alone needs 127 billion annually. And we're discussing 100 billion for the whole developing countries since, and we have not yet met that mark. So I'm hoping that at this COP21, this 100 billion target will be met going forward. We need to expand and deepen the financing, other innovative financing instruments. There are several green financing instruments that are out there, and African countries are not accessing that so much. Currently, Africa is still at 0.28% in terms of access to some of these global finance, the green bonds, sustainability-linked bonds, and so on, debt for climate swaps. There are several innovations out there that need to be made available to Africans. And then we need to increase the concessional financing to support climate adaptation and just energy transitions in Africa. I've just showed you that even if we increased and met that 100 billion, it is very unlikely that it goes to the poorer countries because of lack of capacity to prepare projects. So we need to use existing instruments like the African Development Fund that is already proving itself for transferring, being able to get financing, concessional loans to these vulnerable countries so that funding can reach those who really need the climate finance. Few conclusions. Climate change is a global commons challenge, and this simply means CO2 emissions emit freely in the atmosphere, and they cause their impacts freely anywhere in the world. So it doesn't matter how much we do in the United States or in Europe if Africa doesn't do the same. So we need to make sure that we work on this as a global commons, that we all work together to solve together. There is no point in having effective climate policy elsewhere if we don't have it everywhere. Energy systems should be technologically adequate to meet the economic and social needs of countries, but also cost optimal and very viable. And that viability is in addressing all the transitions that we're talking about collectively, not singly. It's not good enough to try and achieve climate reduction in CO2 emissions and keep people in poverty, because sustainable poverty is not sustainable development. We need to decentralize our energy systems much more than it is currently now. There are huge opportunities there. Technologies are evolving, markets are evolving, and the private sector is investing heavily. Let's take advantage of that. My final word, Africa needs 1.6 trillion in order to address its NDCs by 2030. If that resource is not made available, Africa will not be able to achieve its NDCs. And if Africa doesn't achieve its NDCs, the global community has failed to implement the agreement reached in COP21. So we need to scale the climate financing that we have for the world. Finally, in the middle of all these difficulties lies opportunities. Those are the words of Albert Einstein, not mine. And he also says we cannot use the old map to explore the new world. So we cannot continue business as usual, discussions and discussions. We need actions and actions and actions. And there must be some form of exchange in terms of social, solving this social problem will certainly require redistribution of economic and social and political resources. This again is not my words. It's from Els Oyen, a Norwegian scholar. So we need to act together. We need to work as one community, one body, because we cannot say anymore that Africa can continue to suffer from climate change and we continue to increase our growth elsewhere. Because only together as a global community can we address climate change sustainably. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. You can do better than that. Can you please one more round of applause? Thank you, Kevin, for setting the scene and for clearly articulating the findings of the study. Of course, you have said that there's a link between climate change and macroeconomics, ultimately affected by climate finance. You've also indicated that poorer countries are more vulnerable to climate change. Africa remains the least climate-ready part of the world, and yet it receives the least climate finance that it needs much more than any other part of the world. Dr. Naidu, any reactions before I ask you specific questions?
Thanks for putting me on the spot there. Again, my main reaction would be I totally support what you're saying, and I think that the work that's been done by your team, Professor, is very impactful. Probably what stands out for me is the policy recommendations and both our call to the international community doesn't yet recognize the urgency. I think we're still speaking in very veiled terms to each other, as if though we have time to still have more discussions, more negotiations, more coalitions, more compacts. And I mean, this COP was meant to be about implementation. I hope we can get there. I really do hope we can get there, because how much more arguments do we need to make for the need on the ground? So in South Africa, for example, there's a lot of research that's generated on a number of topics. But at some point you ask, how much more evidence do we need to tell you to do what's right? And that becomes, a real issue. So I think the other thing that's complicated for me is that the use of finance instruments, the different kind of green innovative instruments, we need a situation where we're looking at the heterogeneity of financial systems in the continent. There are some very developed markets like South Africa and maybe even Botswana to some extent, but there's also others that have very local, domestic type of focused areas and institutions. And there's a lot of capabilities that's not being harnessed. And instruments are being put onto countries as opposed to understanding whether those instruments are fit for purpose. So those would be my initial reactions.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll as the lead researcher for the Presidential Climate Finance Task Force in South Africa, how would you look at such partnerships that may be necessary in ensuring that the current lopsidedness in climate finance is changed? Because at the end of the day, we're very clear that Africa doesn't receive enough financing. So what kind of partnerships? Can the South-South Alliance be one of such alternatives? What do you have to say?
If I may respond through the lens of the work we've just done over the last year. So as you may know, South Africa at last year's COP put together with 5 countries this Just Energy Transition Partnership. It was seen as a platform, and it was very much being looked upon as a pioneering initiative of how developing countries can come together around mobilizing resources, particularly for the energy transition, but placing justice at the center of that transition. It's really been a fascinating year, moderator, I must say. It's been a year where the lopsided, if I can start there, and maybe we can start by saying, why do we think it's a lopsided climate finance architecture? And it's also to your point, Professor Kevin, you spoke about this, it's not fit for purpose. But in the context of a transition and post-Paris, why isn't it fit for transition? Because we have historically, especially, I did some time at the Green Climate Fund as well. And one of the hardest things to do working with countries on the continent was trying to break the mindset that what does the donor want? What does the funder want? And what must I write in my proposal to be able to apply for funding? So this is a mindset that we seem to have and not being fully able to articulate needs. So for the Just Energy Transition Partnership in South Africa, our primary goal was to try and put together an investment plan this past year. And that plan contains a portfolio of investments, technology focus, infrastructure focus, but also embedded in it the social preparedness and consequence of transition as Professor Kevin just mentioned in some of his slides. So what makes that plan different is that it was led by written by South Africans, based on South African data, and put together. And some of the things that we realized were difficult is that applying for funding on a project-by-project basis is not going to get us onto a journey for transition. That will not work. We need to go beyond project-by-project approaches. We need to think about portfolios of investments that have to happen. So in the case of South Africa, the things that we have to do in the next 2 years, and we have to do it at a particular pace and depth. We have to build our grid and our transmission infrastructure, because that's like building the spine of the body, so that we can then accelerate the renewable energy components. If we have to do it in any different pace, it's going to fall apart. And we also have to think about different ownership models for renewables, so that we don't only have large businesses that are benefiting. And so that's a question for how we fund these initiatives. But beyond all of that, if we don't prepare communities who are going to be suffering from this transition in terms of jobs, in terms of indirect businesses that are dependent on coal mining, coal power generation. So there's 3 things that have to happen in a particular sequence and in a particular intensity. The one is the grid, the second is renewables, and the third is the social preparedness. So the lopsidedness, to come back to your question, moderator, comes from the fact that everybody just wants to cherry pick from the portfolio. Give me the one that's going to make the most returns. And we're having a response to climate change that's dependent on the risk-return conversation, as opposed to the conversation about what needs to be done. What we tried to do differently in our plan was to highlight what needs to be funded, and we also highlighted the quality of finance that needs to happen, a risk-sharing arrangement, a non-project-by-project approach, a portfolio approach, and also an approach that doesn't add, to the point you were making, adding debt. Climate debt is not climate support. But at the same time, you can't use grants to fund income-generating activities at the same time, because then you're creating other distortions. But it's the right balance relative to the context of that particular country's demands. So the 3 sort of things that I would maybe close with on the question is that in doing a country approach, it wasn't easy really in terms of the conversation with international partners as well. They were very engaging, but we used the capabilities of South African knowledge systems to put us on a place where we could have this investment plan, which is available on our presidency website. So there was really value in the domestic dialogue. And it's a better conversation to sit with a funder and say, I precisely need the funding for these needs. And there's a sequence that I need it. And if you don't give it to us in that sequence, we will fall apart. We will not deliver. And it's not just that we won't meet the Paris Agreement, but if we don't do this, we are committing generations of young Africans, and we are the youngest continent in the world, right? I think the ratio is 1 in every 3rd person is under 35 years old on the continent. It's a fast-growing continent. It is a vibrant continent. We have to do this for those future generations. And the last 2 points is really about our assumptions that go into the conversation. It's not just lopsided climate finance architecture. It's a lopsided financial architecture completely. It's not yet fit for purpose. Yeah, I'll leave it at that, moderator. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you please give her a round of applause? Now, let me take this from what you've said. Some people believe that we need to leapfrog to green energy in Africa. Africa has an opportunity to leapfrog. But from what you've explained, it's not that easy. And that brings me to the point you mentioned, with Kevin, with regard to the need to transition justly, meaning the need for a mix of types of energy, particularly gas, that has been known to be a transition fuel. Now, I was watching a TV program yesterday where the the coal power plant in South Africa is going to be decommissioned. And then they were interviewing the workers. When you said sustainable poverty is not in any way adding to development, they asked them, what are you going to do? Because South Africa is going to decommission this and will replace it with wind and solar. But nobody knows when. And then they asked a young girl, your father works here. What's going to happen to you when he loses his job? She says, well, he cannot provide for my education anymore because there will be no resources. The question is, can Africa really leapfrog? Kevin.
Thank you very much. That's a very, very important question. The question about energy mix, and I have to address this from the perspective of technological transitions, market transitions, and industrial revolutions.
Eric.
So, from what we see already, we see that technologies for renewable energy and cleaner energy options are evolving very fast. The global policy towards adoption of that renewable energy options are also evolving very fast. And the markets are shifting in terms of the costs of access to this renewable energy is coming down very fast. So my advice to countries who want to continue to invest in high polluting energy sources is to simply consider what I will call asset stripping risks, asset stranding risks. Because you may invest in an infrastructure that will take, you will need, the life of the life cycle is 40 years, 50 years, but 10 years down the line, you find that those technologies are no longer in demand, either because the energy prices, the price in the markets has changed so much that it's no longer cost effective, or the policies has changed so much that the demand for it will go off the market, and people's preferences and behaviors will also change. So for me, the energy mix of countries, like we recommended, it needs to be technologically viable, it needs to be cost efficient, and it also needs to be adequate to meet the needs of the countries at that time. But we need to invest smartly, especially in Africa. Given the slides I showed you on the huge competitiveness advantages, and I mean not climate competitiveness, but market competitiveness advantages that Africa has in the new industrial revolution that is happening, which is the green transition. It only makes sense for South Africa to do what it's currently doing, which is actually transitioning to that new market, so that we can get the market shares, develop the technologies, build the productive capacities before we continue to remain as laggards in that market as we have done in the first, second, and third industrial revolution. So my advice would be that countries should invest massively in the renewable energy options and try to transition towards that renewable energy options as fast as they can. But gas, natural gas, should still remain a transition fuel because it is less polluting. And we know that in many countries, as we have seen, those who have been able to transition either do that through natural gas and nuclear energy. And in Africa, natural gas is still abundant, and we need to be able to use that resource to still meet the triple goals of growth, climate resilience, and human sustainability.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I have 16 minutes, and I want to be sure we finish exactly on time. I promise you, you will not run 1 minute over. But let me bring in Mr. Geoffrey Omedo, UNDP Kenya, Energy Options in Kenya, just to chime into the discussion. And then I will ask what I call a final question, and then I will close with some what I could call key messages, making sure that we end up at exactly 1 p.m. Over to you.
Thank you very much. And I think First of all, from Kenya, we are really, really proud of what South Africa managed to do. And I think last year's Glasgow meeting opened our eyes to the opportunities as Africa for pushing for a very, very strategic engagement towards the whole issue of stranded assets and a fair and just transition. Kenya is one of the countries that is doing very well in terms of having a very clean electricity grid. Over 93% of our electricity comes from renewable sources. I think you know, most of you know that we are doing very well in terms of the energy from the geothermal. It's currently contributing to close to 15% of our electricity grid. We are also doing quite well in solar energy in terms of our grid. And we also are very privileged to have Africa's largest wind power farm that is now contributing energy to the grid right now. So while we boast of having a very, very clean electricity grid, above 95%, the government is keen to do 100% transition to an entirely clean grid by the year 2030. The country has also discovered some significant deposits of coal. So we are one of the countries that have coal that we are yet to start tapping into. And this question of just and fair transition will definitely come up. The government is keen to extract the economic benefits from coal as well. While we have a clean grid, the large population is yet to have access to this grid. 80% of our communities still use charcoal and firewood and biomass, which are driving the deforestation issues in the country. So while the large bulk of the population still relies on biomass and firewood, the urban areas heavily rely on charcoal for cooking and warming the houses. So we are yet to see this transition being witnessed in the households. And that's going to be a major challenge. So as we look at the globe, think of doing what Kenya has done in terms of ensuring that we have a clean grid, there's need for support, financial support. For countries like Kenya that have coal deposits, we also have petroleum deposits that are also being prospected, and they are actually going to be very viable in terms of economic support to the country. But this question of just and fair transition will have to be held with regard to how to support Kenya effectively benefit from the massive investments that Kenya has done in terms of renewable energy, and also how we can be able to benefit when we leave our assets in the ground, when they become stranded assets. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That comes from Kenya. I'm going to ask a question, and I'm going to throw it to you at the audience, and someone may well try to answer this question. Possibly, sir, I see you are keen. Haven't heard all that the panelists have said, particularly from the report that was presented and the initial summary that I gave. What are the implementable policy actions that could support Africa's smooth transition to net zero carbon emission in the coming years, as well as contribute to the whole idea of climate finance that we're talking about to enable a just energy transition in Africa? Over to you, sir.
OK.
Allez-y.
La transition énergétique ne peut pas se faire sans le secteur privé. Il faut absolument que, à la fois les gouvernements, les institutions de développement intègrent véritablement le secteur privé dans toute la chaîne de valeur. Parce que le problème, c'est toute la chaîne de valeur. Le plus gros problème qu'il y a par rapport à ça, c'est l'accès à l'énergie. Si on veut avoir accès aux équipements énergétiques, il faut travailler sur toute la chaîne de valeur pour la rendre suffisamment attractive pour que ça coûte nettement moins cher. Parce que les équipements, lorsqu'ils sont fabriqués, 100% des équipements sont faits ailleurs, avec des produits ailleurs. Alors que si sur place, en Afrique, nous produisons ces produits avec des produits locaux, je suis assuré que le coût d'accès sera nettement moins cher. Et puis la question qu'on peut se poser, c'est, vous avez vu la différence entre les besoins de l'Afrique et ce qu'on est capable de mobiliser. La première question, c'est de savoir, est-ce que l'argent existe? Effectivement, on peut dire que l'argent n'existe pas. Mais lorsqu'on voit le conflit en Ukraine et les moyens qui ont été mobilisés, l'argent existe. Vous voyez, l'argent existe. Maintenant, comment on a accès à cet argent? Parce que les 99 milliards d'écart, comment on a accès à notre argent? Nous n'avons pas l'organisation sur place pour pouvoir avoir accès à cet argent. Donc, il faut renforcer les capacités internes. Il faut qu'on ait plus de spécialistes en interne qui connaissent vraiment tous les mécanismes liés à la finance climatique. Sinon, ce n'est pas possible. Ce n'est pas possible. Voilà ce que je voulais dire. Merci.
Thank you very much. The need to get involved, the private sector involved in the whole process. Any other person from the floor? Okay, yourself?
Thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I speak English. At least that's really. My name is Pavin Gala. I work with Oxfam. And it was really great to hear your reflections in terms of what is needed for the African continent. And I would actually challenge us because in articulating some of the figures where you talked about the resources needed for NDCs, the resources needed for COVID recovery, it's also just articulating what is needed clearly in distinguishing the needs, especially on the just energy transition. My brother from Kenya mentioned the fact that despite a 90%, 93%, grid that is fed by renewable energy, we're talking about 80% of the population that is still using biomass. And if you were to spread it across Africa, I think my understanding is that we have around 700 billion people, in a sense, still not having access to anything beyond electricity. They do not have that. So I'm just curious on one part, indeed, in terms of us being able at this COP27 to say this is what is clearly needed in terms of resources for that just energy transition. We are talking about the work that South Africa is doing, but I also want to challenge us, colleagues, because we know that in terms of the development pipeline that has been there in the West, it has been very much based on access to a certain type of energy, So as we're talking about discoveries, one of the things I've been hearing a lot is, what is the African solution to these issues? At the moment, in as much as we are saying over 100 billion is needed for the African continent, is also saying, look, on the table at the moment, we have this, and we also want you to deliver on your end because we know very much the fact that the climate change issue is not one that is generated from the African continent. So I would say part of our solutions are about showing what we are committed to as an African continent, but also saying you also need to deliver on your part because this was not generated from the African continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There was somebody? Then yourself? Okay, lots of hands. I don't want to run over time. Go ahead.
My name is Rokiatou Traore. I'm from Mali. I'm an entrepreneur involved in creating economic, environmental, and social impact via an inclusive value chain around Moringa. So I really like the statement when you were saying those people, the vulnerable people, don't really have access to finance. So in climate resilience, social entrepreneurs play a great role in mitigating and in mitigating the effects of climate change. So my question is, what are the solutions for social entrepreneurs? Because we all know they make profit, but they make more impact than profit. And the profit that they make is not enough to face loan. So what are the solutions given by IFD to face this problem?
Thank you very much. Sir. What is the solution you have for social
entrepreneurs? My name is Ahmed Shehbouni. I'm from Morocco. I have two questions. The first one is one of the 5 top from the African Bank is industrializing Africa. Do you believe with solar energy we can industrialize Africa? And do you know any country in the world who became industrialized with solar energy? The second question is, you addressed recommendation for developed country to honor their engagement. This recommendation, I heard it more than 10 years before, and each time we asked developed country to honor this. And how about recommendation to our leader in Africa, like stop corruption, stop conflict, more democracy, etc. Work together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The gentleman behind. I'll take the last question. After that, I'll take one more, and that's the last question.
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank the panelists. My name is Sulaiman. I'm from Nigeria. Beautiful presentation from the AFDB, and I just want to say that we've been on this finance conversation for a long time, and not much seems to be yielding. But there are some other finances that needs to be opened up for Africa, which is not part of the conversation. So Africa loses much more through illicit financial flow out of the continent. Africa loses much more through unbalanced and unfair trading. Africa loses much more tied down through looted assets in some developed countries. These finances need to be freed for Africa to be able to catch up with because climate change for Africa is an existential issue, perhaps for more than the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The lady, and then you, finally.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Marcy.
Very short.
My name is Marcy from Kenya. I want to appreciate first all of UNDP and the support they're giving, especially to the county government. I'm in charge of climate change. And I want to appreciate what you've said. I think what African we need to get out of this with is the low-hanging fruit. Otherwise, we'll end up going round and round. So what is this that we can pick? Very first from his conversation, he said very clearly, the enabling environment is what is lacking. So we may go so much and round, yet we do not have the supporting capacity to be able even to receive this climate financing. So I really want to get out of here with low-hanging fruit. What is this that we can do immediately to be able to progress?
Thank you very much, yourself. And then that's the last question.
Pino, South Africa. I wanted to ask, in terms of building resilience, you need to build a sense of pride. Coming here, for most of us, especially from Africa, our budget shortfall was about 30%, where the West gained 30% in terms of the currency exchange. So to the African Bank, what then, or what is your stance on creating one currency for Africa, which will enable us to fight back the current situation that we are seeing now? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, I'm not going to let you answer all the questions because those questions are very much loaded. But just 1 second comment from each of you, and then we'll close it. 1 second.
Okay. I think my 1 second comment will be stressing the fact that climate change is a global commons problem, and we need global coalitions to address them. Without that, we will not succeed.
Thank you.
So my 1 second would be, we have more power than we think we have as Africans. If we articulate very clearly what we need, and we are brave and bold enough to say the quality of what we want, how we want it, and get as many partners on board as possible, to your point about private sector, but also philanthropy, we should own our power. I don't think we do it enough as Africans.
Thank you. Adopting renewable energy in Africa, in my view, will help us leapfrog many of the countries that relied on fossil fuels to develop. We are privileged to have solar. We are privileged to have some of the best rivers. We are privileged in Kenya to have geothermal energy. What we simply need to do is invest massively in this area while we have a conversation on how to reduce reliance on fossil fuels. I think it's possible.
Thank you very much for your 1 second. Ladies and gentlemen, a lot of questions were asked. Those questions will be answered in appropriate venues. The issue of a common currency will reside with the African Union, not the African Development Bank. The impact of social investors and how the bank can assist them, there are projects and programs that are designed to deal with those. It's been a wonderful panel. You have a lot of questions. You have a lot of answers yourself as well. But the point remains that as Africa, we must do something for ourselves. Again, the commitments that are supposed to be fulfilled by the donors, it is not because we don't want to do anything for ourselves, because they have polluted the world for thousands of years, and Africa has not done any of that. So they owe Africa, and they must fulfill the pledge. Thank you very much. We have an announcement to be made by Kevin. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We have papers here that have QR codes for the reports. We have the report at the Pan-African level, at the 5 regions of Africa, and for each country of the continent. So if you use the QR code, you will be able to access all the reports so you can know the status. And I will encourage our policymakers and our leaders, when you go for your negotiations, please go with these facts so that we can have evidence-based policy dialogue. Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming.